Before diving into this incredible story, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the bell. Every story here has something to say, and you won't want to miss a single one. Their mother's house was nothing more than a memory, empty and silent, as if the very walls were holding their breath. After years of arguments and suppressed grudges, the children had finally made a decision to sell the family home. Once the deed was signed, the money collected, they had left no room for compassion. Their mother, Margaret, an elderly woman with a back bent by time and hardship, suddenly found herself homeless. The house keys slipped from her trembling hands like a truth too heavy to bear. Her children, whom she had raised with patience and love, had left her on the street, exposed to the icy wind and the indifference of the world. Passers-by occasionally glanced at her, but no one stopped. No one knew that she carried more memories on her shoulders than most people will ever have. Every step on the sidewalk echoed like a cruel reminder: the love of family can disappear as quickly as money changes hands. And yet, despite the pain and abandonment, a fragile fire still burned in Margaret's eyes. A fire that refused to be extinguished, a fire that would drive her to seek justice, dignity, and perhaps, to reveal the truth her children had wanted to bury with her. Margaret walked slowly along the sidewalk, her hands clutching a small bag containing a few clothes and yellowed photographs. The evening breeze bit at her skin, but it was the cold of her children's indifference that pierced her heart. David, the eldest, had always been pragmatic, but today his coldness had become unbearable. "We can't afford to keep this house, Mom," he'd said, without a glance at her. Beside him, Jessica, the middle, shrugged casually. "You'll find somewhere to go. It's not our problem." And then there was Mark, the youngest, looking down, unable to meet her gaze, but too cowardly to protest. Margaret's house, once full of laughter and warmth, now seemed a monument to her failure. Every window, every door, brought back memories that no one else seemed to want to keep. As she walked down the street, Margaret felt the stares of passers-by. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others whispered among themselves. But no one stopped to help the old woman who had raised 3 children with love and sacrifice. Yet, despite the humiliation and pain, Margaret refused to give in to despair. She knew she had to find refuge and regain control of her life. And, deep down, a thought began to form: her children would one day regret this betrayal. Margaret found refuge in a small, abandoned park, under a bench where a few dead leaves formed a flimsy cushion. She sat down, tired, but her thoughts were far from restful. She wondered why her children had been so cruel. Was it simply money that had changed them, or was there something deeper she had never seen? She thought back to David, so cold and calculating. Ever since his teenage years, he had always had a taste for control and domination. Jessica, on the other hand, seemed driven by a desire for total independence, but sometimes her eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and jealousy. As for Mark, the youngest, he still seemed attached to her, but his cowardice and lack of courage had prevented any rebellion against his elders. Margaret realized then that the sale of the house was only the tip of the iceberg. Her children had kept secrets, made decisions behind her back, and she had never suspected a thing. A shudder ran through her. This betrayal was not just material, it was personal and profound. With renewed determination, she stood up. She had to discover what they were hiding, understand what had turned her children into such cold beings, and above all, she had to survive to face this truth. Margaret knew she wasn't ready to give up yet. In the shadows of the park, she silently swore that tomorrow would mark the beginning of a fight for her dignity, and perhaps, for a justice that she would not let slip away. The next morning, Margaret wandered the city streets, her worn shoes dragging on the hot concrete sidewalk. Every corner seemed foreign, every hurried face made her feel invisible. She had never imagined life would treat her like this, after all these years of sacrifice for her children. As she walked past a small cafeteria, she noticed a young man behind the counter looking at her in surprise. His name was Marcus, and despite his youth, he had a kind look in his eyes. Seeing Margaret trembling, he took out a hot coffee and handed it to her without question. "You should eat something, madam," he said softly. "No one deserves to spend the day like this." Margaret felt a surge of emotion. It had been so long since she had received a gratuitous gesture of kindness. She accepted the coffee, thanking Marcus in a trembling voice. Later, while looking for a place to rest, Margaret met Gloria, an older woman who was also living on the streets. Gloria talked to her about survival, finding safe places and small ways to feed herself. Margaret realized that if she wanted to survive, she had to quickly learn how to navigate this new world, which she had never known before. For the first time since being abandoned by her children, Margaret felt a spark of hope. Perhaps the streets weren't just a place of despair, perhaps they could also become a place of learning and strength. But she knew the road would be long, and her children wouldn't go unpunished if she discovered their secret. Margaret had settled into a small shelter under an abandoned porch, a discreet corner Gloria had shown her. Every night, after she had eaten and found a safe place to sleep, she reflected on her children and what had driven them to betrayal. One day, while rummaging through a trash can near a cafe, Margaret found an envelope that had fallen out of a forgotten bag. Inside were several bank statements and a letter signed by David, stating that the sale of the house was not just for immediate cash, but that he had invested some of it in a secret project in which Jessica and Mark were involved. Margaret felt a mixture of anger and curiosity. What were they planning, and why had they excluded her? She remembered Gloria's words, "If you want to survive here, you have to understand those around you, and sometimes those who betrayed you give you the clues themselves." Margaret decided to follow this lead discreetly. She needed to discover the true colors of her children and understand their ambitions before deciding how to confront them. This discovery changed everything. The betrayal wasn't just material, it was calculated, orchestrated, and Margaret now knew that her children believed they could manipulate her and forget her. But she wouldn't let that happen. A clear idea dawned in her mind: she was going to regain control, not only of her life, but also of the truth about what her children had really done. Margaret lay awake all night, pondering what to do next. The bank statements and David's letter were a window into the truth. Her children thought they'd shut her out, but she was going to use that ignorance to her advantage. She began writing down every detail she could glean: transaction dates, contacts mentioned, financial plans. Each piece of information was a piece of the puzzle that would allow her to regain control. When morning came, she returned to Gloria for advice. Gloria, who knew the streets and the people who lived there, gave her a simple but effective plan: start small, Margaret. Watch, listen, understand. Then strike where they least expect it. Margaret followed this advice. She kept a low profile, observing her children's habits from a distance. She discovered that David spent his days at his office with influential associates, Jessica spent money on extravagant purchases, and Mark tried to maintain a delicate balance between the demands of his elders and his own feelings of guilt. This surveillance allowed her to understand a crucial point: despite their coldness, her children still depended on her, consciously or not. And Margaret understood that her revenge would not be an explosion of anger, but a subtle game of patience and strategy. For the first time since her abandonment, she felt power returning to her hands. She was no longer the vulnerable woman on the street, she had become a watchful observer, a quiet force ready to demand justice and respect. Margaret knew she couldn't do it alone. The streets had taught her one essential thing: strength lies in alliances, even the most unexpected. She returned to Marcus, the young man from the cafe, and cautiously explained that she had to reclaim what had been unjustly taken from her. Marcus, impressed by her determination and intelligence, discreetly agreed to help her. Then she met Gloria, who introduced her to a few other people from the street community, all with useful skills. Some knew the financial records, others had contacts in the city, and all were willing to help Margaret, fascinated by her strength and her intact dignity despite abandonment. With her small group, Margaret began organizing her information. David had regular appointments and money transfers, and Jessica seemed vulnerable to rumors and criticism. Mark, the most sensitive, could become an entry point for reconciliation or strategic manipulation. Every detail learned was a potential weapon. Margaret felt her energy returning. Every day spent on the streets was no longer a burden, but a training session. She was learning to observe, to listen, to understand her children's weaknesses and strengths. And above all, she was preparing to strike where they never expected it: their own conscience and their public conscience. For the first time since the betrayal, Margaret was no longer a victim. She was a strategist, a quiet force ready to reclaim her place in the world and remind her children that blood does not excuse everything. Margaret, now prepared and surrounded by her allies, decided it was time to test her children. She didn't want to reveal the whole truth yet, but to send them small signals, just enough to sow doubt and observe their reactions. The first gesture was subtle. She sent Jessica an anonymous letter containing excerpts from bank statements and a few clues about the true nature of David's plans. Jessica, at first incredulous, began to wonder if everything she thought she knew about the sale of the house and the money was true. David, meanwhile, was confronted with a rumor carefully orchestrated by Marcus and Gloria in his professional circle. Some associates began asking questions about recent transactions. Tensions quickly mounted, and David, accustomed to controlling every situation, felt anxiety creeping in for the first time. Mark, the youngest, received a note slipped through his mailbox, signed by a mysterious know-it-all. The message awakened the guilt he had always felt but had repressed. For the first time, he wondered if his passivity had truly protected his mother or if he had contributed to her downfall. Margaret watched these reactions with a mixture of satisfaction and caution. Her children's every move was analyzed, every emotion decoded. She knew that the hardest part was not just confronting them, but doing it with control, so that justice would be served without losing her dignity in the process. This first psychological assault was a success. Her children began to understand, without knowing who was pulling the strings, that the mother they had thought they had abandoned was not an easy victim. After the initial confrontations, Margaret felt the time had come to truly regain control. Her children were no longer the same. David showed signs of anxiety, Jessica hesitated over every decision, and Mark seemed torn between guilt and loyalty. With the help of Marcus and Gloria, Margaret began gathering tangible evidence of how her children had manipulated the sale of the house and used the money for their own benefit. Bank documents, contracts signed behind their backs, and carefully preserved emails became her weapons. Each discovery strengthened her resolve and helped her build a relentless strategy. She decided to confront Mark first. The ever-sensitive young man was surprised when she appeared at his home, calm and authoritative. She spoke to him gently but firmly about David and Jessica's betrayal and manipulation. Mark, shaken, began to understand that he had been complicit by silence and promised to help her repair the situation. With an ally within the family, Margaret could now orchestrate what came next more effectively. She sent anonymous warnings to David and Jessica, but this time with concrete evidence, bank statements, compromising emails, and testimonies from their own colleagues. Fear gradually settled into her children's minds. For the first time since her abandonment, Margaret felt a real return of power. She was no longer the frail old woman on the street, she was the mistress of her destiny, ready to demand justice and expose the truth. The long-awaited day arrived. Margaret, accompanied by Mark and his allies, had carefully planned every detail. David and Jessica didn't yet know that the mother they had thought abandoned was ready to confront them and expose their machinations. Margaret summoned them to a neutral meeting room, a space where she could control the situation. From the moment they arrived, she remained calm, her gaze piercing, like a flame ready to consume everything in its path. David and Jessica, surprised, exchanged worried glances. They finally perceived the seriousness of her approach. "You thought you could erase me from your lives," Margaret said firmly. "But I know your secrets, your manipulations, and your lies. And I'm here to see that justice is served." She laid out, one by one, all the documents she had gathered, the doctored bank statements, the contracts signed behind her back, and the compromising messages. Each piece of evidence shattered a wall of pretense that David and Jessica had erected. Jessica burst into tears, realizing the full impact of her actions, while David tried to defend his decisions, but his words rang hollow and ineffective in the face of the evidence of his betrayal. Mark, at her side, supported his mother, adding strength and credibility to her testimony. Margaret ended with one last sentence, firm and icy. "Blood alone is not enough to justify cruelty. You chose money and ego over family. But today, the truth is finally revealed." The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, her children understood that the mother they had thought weak was, in reality, a relentless and just force. After the confrontation, Margaret felt an immense weight lifted from her shoulders. She had confronted her children, exposed their lies, and regained control of her life. But she knew that true reconstruction wasn't achieved solely through revenge, it required rebuilding her daily life and regaining her dignity. With the help of Mark, who had finally realized his mistakes, Margaret bought a small, modest but welcoming house. She transformed this space into a place of serenity and happy memories, far from the betrayal and manipulation of David and Jessica. Marcus and Gloria, always by her side, helped her organize her life, both materially and emotionally. David and Jessica, publicly humiliated and confronted with the truth, had to face the consequences of their choices. Their careers were shaken by the revelations and they had to come to terms with their guilt, while Mark, once again a loyal and honest son, accompanied his mother in this new phase of his life. Margaret, finally free from the shadow of betrayal, realized that her strength came not only from her ability to defend herself, but from her resilience, her patience, and her will to remain dignified despite everything. She had lost a home, but she had regained much more, her freedom, her honor, and the renewed respect of her children, who would forever learn that family love cannot be betrayed with impunity. And as she sat on the porch of her new home, watching the sunset, Margaret smiled softly. Life had taught her that even after the cruelest betrayal, it was possible to be reborn, stronger and wiser than ever.